So we can think of a hierarchy of economic systems from worst to the best. The worst is large inequality and low productivity. Feudal societies and dictatorships, quite a few of them you'll see in the present world also. If you have a dictator, would you really be investing your time and effort in creating something? Because the dictator is going to grab it. The improvement is when you have large inequality and still high productivity, like a free market can be, some free markets would produce that large inequality, but they would be very productive. And better than like the previous two are lower inequality and high productivity, as happened in a lot of the European countries in the 20th century and the 21st century. There was a lot of social services which was provided to the citizens. But anyway, I mean, it's the, but I'm not sure, but I think inequality is increasing everywhere, including Europe. Well, there are three improvements that can be made. And, the lowest level, then the second level, and the highest level. Okay. At the lowest level, the improvement that can be made to economic systems is redistributive taxation. So let's look at redistributive taxation. Now, the free markets have the virtues of accountability and incentives, but they can produce a large levels of inequality that are not compatible with strong communities. So, information issues, economies of scale tend to produce high levels of inequality. Because of things like first mover advantage or economies of scale, you will have only a few industries, a few farms in many industries. Okay, so they'll be like what I call oligopolies. And these can be quite profitable because they have some market power. And that makes their profitability makes their stakeholders or the equity holders or the management, especially senior management, it makes them quite wealthy. Okay. So you have in an economy some farms which have stakeholders who are quite wealthy in comparison to the rest of the economy. Now, within a farm also, you have a pyramidal structure because, you start off with you can only have one CEO. You can't have multiple CEOs, and then each division will have some division leader and so on. So then there are two pyramids. One, there is a pyramid of farms. There are some very profitable farms, especially in the new industries, high tech, etc., which are more profitable than other farms. That's the first pyramid. And the second is within a farm also there's a pyramid where there are only a few people at the top who earn have a lot of get a lot of wealth, whereas as you progress down, the larger number of people with less economic wealth. Okay, so this combination of two pyramids, one internal to farms and the other just external between farms and within farms, creates a pyramidal structure for the entire economy. Now, there's really no economic theory which tells us how steep this pyramid is going to be. Right? Like steep means like something like this. A flat pyramid is something like this. So steep pyramid is like greater inequality. And there's no economic theory which like tells us that this is how much inequality a free market left to itself will produce. Now, voters, however, in a democracy can use redistributive taxation to flatten a pyramid. So, direct taxes essentially increase the price of labor. Negative direct taxes can increase the price of labor. Negative indirect taxes, so like negative sales taxes, can reduce the price of goods consumed by the lower income individuals and families. Now, why this particular form to reduce inequality? Because we still want the free market. We do not want to lose the virtues of accountability and incentives which a free market has. Of course, if you tax something, then the argument goes, oh, you're reducing the incentive to work by the people who you're putting a positive income tax on and all that. Yeah, whatever. I don't think it has a major impact. Okay, yeah, you can make an argument, but I don't think it's really important. I do not believe that you should have things like universal basic income, which basically hands out money to everybody. Those who are able to work should work, because people lose respect for themselves if they're receiving handouts. You want them to feel that they can be productive. So you want them to give the opportunity to be productive, and you want to give them a wage that is fair and that incentivizes them to work. So the negative direct tax will increase the price of labor, because we don't know where the price of labor is going to head if we just leave the free market itself. If it gets very steep, by very steep I mean that there's some few people at the very top, and they just get a lot of the wealth, economic wealth. So by steep I mean great inequality. By flat I mean, okay, there's not so much difference between the different layers. Okay, now we can do a general equilibrium analysis, and I did write a paper, and I'm just going to talk about it a bit. It's quite technical. So you see, what happens with this, this inequality is that if you really want to analyze inequality in the tradition of equilibrium analysis, you cannot just have your inputs to production as labor and capital, because that assumes that all labor is the same. But we know that is not true. Managers and they have experienced a great increase in wealth, and especially if you look at the past 40 years, starting from let's say early 1980s, when you had these free trade agreements. What it did to a country like the US is that the free trade agreements increased competition for blue-collar workers, because now they had to compete with blue-collar workers from much poorer countries. And white-collar workers, on the other hand, saw an increase in the demand for their services. And what the result was that you had the situation where white collar workers did much better than blue collar workers, and inequality in the economy increased, and to levels which I believe are like not good for the health of the society. So to analyze this systematically, and if you're going to kind of like say, okay, I want to figure out what is the optimal level of tax. If you want to answer that question, you have to like, let's say, start systematically. So I wrote this paper where I had two kinds of workers. Like, look, labor was not homogeneous. There were two kinds of labor, white collar and blue collar. And then I had their, you have their utility functions, and they're what they are consuming two goods and leisure. So the two goods is one good is the product of the white collar, which I call management, and the other is the product of the blue collars, which I call vendibles. And then what you say, okay, just do the standard analysis. You say that white collars and blue collars will be maximizing their utilities, and then you sort of have to do that so that you can solve it. So you have to sort of make a pseudo lifetime utilities, and the white collar and the blue collar also choose between how much work to provide and how much leisure to have. This is something which makes it a bit more complicated, this model. You can alternatively just assume that white collars have a certain fixed amount of work which they can provide, and blue collars have a fixed amount, so that you don't have to do this particular optimization. Then you have the choice. Now then you kind of do the first order conditions to find the equilibrium. And for example, you have the choice between production of management and leisure for white collar workers. There's an equation in there for that. Then there is let me actually, this should be come a bit later. Okay, this is where this one should be. So now then, of course, the white collar, the blue collars, and the government, they have budget constraints. And then you have the government, and also has a budget constraint. Then you come to the first order conditions for maximizing utility. And there you have, like for example, white collar workers choosing between, they have their two products, so management and vendibles. I mean, management can really be like well-paying professional services, and that the choice between that gives you this first order condition, equation 14. And similarly, there's the choice between production of management and leisure for white collars. And then you have these similar first order conditions for blue collars. So, obviously, okay, you write out I wrote out the equations fine. So I have a set of equations. I have a number of variables, and the number of variables has to equal the number of equations, and you can get it to a solution. I'm not going to get into things like fixed point theorems to show that it has it's a unique solution. Anyway, so the second part of the paper divided the US population into two parts, top 25 and the bottom 75, and I call the top 25 white collar and the bottom 75 blue collar. And the third and the final part of the paper gets to the issue of what is the optimum tax, and for that you need a social utility function. You need to know what exactly this model is going to, why you did this model, and why you wrote all these equations, because at some point you want to use that model for policy, and to do that you need something called a social utility function. Now, obviously the social utility function and this set of equations, they can't be analyzed analytically, they have to be maximized numerically. And also, you have to do a few calibrations to, you observe, okay, how much leisure is being consumed, for example, or what is the wealth level, and using those calibrations you can calculate some of the parameters in this model. Now, so that is the proper rigorous way to go about doing this, right? And you see the okay, I don't know. Without a social utility function, what is the meaning of this mathematical model if you don't have a social utility function? And the thing is that most of the time when people do these models, they do not do a social utility function, because that gets into normative issues, which I think they're afraid of, because when you say that, okay, this is what a social utility function should look like, then you're saying this group should be given this much weight and that group should be given that much weight, and that gets political. So they just try to avoid. They want to give a impression of being very scientific and above all that. So what they do is that they use GDP as a proxy for the social utility function. It's a stealth social utility function. Yeah, but GDP is a very bad social utility function, because GDP ignores any distribution issues. It ignores all issues of inequality. And that is not going to work. Okay, you cannot get away from the normative issues when you want to decide policy. You can't have a policy that I'm just going to maximize GDP and I don't care how much inequality is being produced. That's not going to work. You're going to get like very angry, part of the electorate being very angry and wanting to throw out the incumbents and like bring in people like, who make them promises or whatever. Okay. The other issue is that this cannot be solved analytically, obviously, but academics, they usually want like analytical solutions. They like math, they like mathematical solutions, but that's kind of, I don't think that's the way to go, because if you want to actually model the world, and it's not very, like you've not ignored like many issues, then you're going to get a model which cannot be solved analytically. It's like telling an aircraft designer that they cannot use numerical solutions to the Navier-Stokes equations and can only use analytical exact solutions. Okay. So if you're trying to design the best economy, you're trying to design the best fiscal policy, then yeah, use numerical solutions. Okay, now this taxation. So there is that academic view of taxation for those who believe, like especially other proponents of free markets, is that they are discretionary and they cause deadweight losses, and they take us away from the optimal. So how true is the idea that absence of taxes produces an optimal outcome? There's obviously, like, there's that issue of public goods, which is well understood. And if the social utility is not the same as individual utility, then you can get, you have to impose taxes to get to the optimal. But beyond that divergence between social and individual utilities, there are also the presence of information issues and transaction costs that result in suboptimal outcomes. And there's a very stark example of corporate governance. And you had this, like, at one time leading tech company, and the new CEO came in early 2010, and 8 years later, at the end of the tenure of the CEO, the market cap of this firm had fallen from 163 billion to 114 billion, while at the same time the competitors had added 1900 billion, 2200 billion, and 3100 billion. So by any measure, the CEO had caused great loss of wealth for the shareholders. Now, for these ideas that taxes are distortionary or the free market will produce an optimal, what you need is that the shareholders are able to exercise control. So the shareholders are the principals, the management are the agents, and the shareholders are able to exercise control, which makes the managers efficient, to work efficiently and not destroy value, but to create value. And it was totally failed. It didn't happen. You can see, like, how, and this manager got paid like over $100 billion. So why did that? Because firstly, like, the information problems is that when the shareholders, when this manager was initially hired, they had no way of knowing exactly what the marginal productivity, how much value this manager would add to the firm. And once the manager became entrenched, then you can't really you can't fire them because of the free rider problem, where it is too costly for fragmented shareholders to keep entrenched management accountable. So in the real world, we see this great divergence between marginal productivity and wages, and it contradicts the idea of free markets producing the optimal outcomes. So yes, intervention is needed, and the intervention should, like, try to maintain the virtues of the free market, hence which are accountability and incentives. Hence you want to have proportional taxes like negative income taxes and negative sales taxes on selected goods. And even if it wasn't like producing, even if it was producing the optimal, the free market, which it doesn't, but suppose it was, but then it was also producing a lot of inequality, that cannot be a good thing, because over time that inequality in the society will have serious issues and will lead to the failure of the society. So, along with ideas like Chap, which lack empirical support, Ricardo's comparative advantage is gospel in universities, academia, which support these ideas of free trade. Now, I know it's been expanded by people like Bhagwati. They have sort of worked and made it, added some features to it. But here's the thing. The idea that free trade is good for a country's economy is absolutely persistent. Now, this needs examination because this idea has had a tremendous impact. So, it has actually created a lot of misery for large sections of the population. What is obvious from, if you do like Ricardo's, if you follow Ricardo's idea, okay, GDP should increase, the production frontier of the world should expand outwards. However, what that argument entirely ignores is what happens to the distribution inside a country. Now, a country should follow economic policies which take into consideration the welfare of all of its citizens, not just certain sections of it, right? If you don't have that and you have growing inequality, then it's finally going to fail. The country is going to fail. Also, what we observe is that nowhere in Ricardo's theory does it suggest that inequality should increase with free trade. Nor does it suggest that a country would keep piling up on foreign debt. So Ricardo's theory does not actually, and it's like, it's supposed to have like these benefits of comparative advantage and etc., like expanding the production frontier outwards. But what you see in reality is that you see an persistent trade deficit, growing inequality, and a persistent growth. I mean, with a persistent trade deficit comes a persistent growth in foreign debt. Now, so what about this foreign debt? At some point, future taxpayers will have to repay this debt. Now, this debt is essentially enabling greater consumption today. And if you are like really free, if you really believe in utility functions and that's the be all and end all, yes, then greater consumption today is supposed to be good. However, if you really have a scientific view of the human nature, which is there in another part of my video, then you realize that humans get a reward, which is what they seek, for a variety of things, for a portfolio of things. They get love. They don't just get it for greater consumption. They get it for relationships, they get it for a feeling of security, they get it for a feeling that they have done their duty, and so on. Okay. Now, this thing that, okay, we are going to kind of keep piling on debt because it's enabling us to have greater consumption is totally wrong, because at some point in the future, the taxpayers will have to repay this debt. And this debt is being used to finance greater current consumption. And this debt can have like unpleasant long-term consequences like high inflation, to reduce the real value of debt, like whatever debt you gave to foreigners. I mean, let's have hyperinflation, make that debt worthless. That's not a good strategy. Okay, or you could end up selling your productive assets to foreigners. Foreign debt may be justified if it is used for positive net present value investments that will increase a nation's productive capacity by an amount sufficient to pay back the entire foreign debt. Trade deficits for investment purposes are okay, but they should be avoided for greater current consumption. It's all there in this book, and I actually have discussed all these issues. And of course, you have the book QR code right there. Now, effective action against trade deficits is lacking. There are actually powerful lobbies which want these trade deficits to persist. So a country is not homogeneous. There, in a country like the US, which is running trade deficits, persistent trade deficits, there are people who actually benefit from it. Okay? And now, who are the people who benefit from it? Well, this growing foreign debt, which the US, growing amount of debt which US sells to foreigners, what does it do? It keeps the US dollar strong. Keeping the US dollar strong means that foreign labor is more competitive, and it's a competitive disadvantage for American labor when the dollar is strong. What else do we see during this time when we have all these free trade agreements? It started like, let's say, sometime around the 1980s when countries in East Asia, the US was importing more and more from them, and then increased further with NAFTA, the WTO, and then the latest attempt was the Trans-Pacific Pact, which failed. So this growing debt allows the dollar to remain strong, and sometime in the future it may finally collapse, but in the meantime it remains strong, and that works against the US worker, because it puts the US worker at a disadvantage compared to foreign workers when it comes to foreign companies. Firms would rather manufacture in foreign companies because the labor costs would be lower because of the stronger dollar. So so does that mean we should not trade? No. There is value in trading. Besides, of course, there are economic benefits, and there are also things like the world should interact with each other. There should be more for the sake of harmony. And however, what you should do is you should have balanced trade. You should not have free trade. I mean, this whole thing of running persistent trade deficits and financing it by issuing debt is just bad. It's unfair to domestic workers, and it'll have serious negative consequences in the future. What you can do is you can have balanced trade. Now, what is balanced trade? Well, balanced trade, you impose tariffs till your trade deficit disappears. Now, would a foreign country retaliate against tariffs? If they're sensible, they should not, because if they're running a trade surplus and then they put tariffs on American goods, then the trade surplus will not be reduced because their purchases of American goods would fall. So it is best for the foreign country to understand that this persistent surplus which they have with respect to the US is not a good thing, and they should accept tariffs which the US may impose till the trade deficit goes away. And actually, it's not really be the calculation should not be like who the US has a trade deficit of surplus with. It should rather be whether these foreign countries themselves have trade deficits of surplus, because they're like countries. India. India does not have, it's almost balanced, right? It runs a surplus against the US, but it also has to pay a lot to buy oil. So overall, India is not really running trade surplus. So the countries which should either increase their purchases of American goods or reduce their exports to the US should be the ones which are running large trade surpluses. Okay. Now, there's also this issue of growing inequality in the US, and this is just, it is the, you can say it is one of the biggest challenges of our time. You want a healthy country, you cannot have growing inequality to be growing. Some amount of inequality is necessary because of efficiency. Founders of firms which run their firms well, which have produced a lot of value, should definitely nothing should be done to deprive them of control of their firms. However, one can leave control of firms with the founders while also using different sorts of taxes to reduce inequality. And what do we have here? We have here in the last 4 decades, starting from the 1980s, we have the growth in real income for the bottom 20th to 40th percentile was about 25%, for the 60th percentile was about 45%, and the 80th percentile 75%. So you can see like how over time the share of income has become more unequal. And I've spoken before, obviously, what you want to do is you don't want to discard the free market because that gives you incentives and accountability. What you want to do is you want to raise the price of labor by negative direct taxes, and you want to lower the price of basic consumption items by negative indirect taxes. And if you want to do some calculations about what the optimum amount of direct and indirect taxes are, you can solve that equilibrium model, my equilibrium model that I presented earlier, which had 2 kinds of agents in it, white collars and blue collars, and you can sort of like go through the calculations to come up with some optimal. And that, of course, you have to use a more reasonable, a more realistic, a more real social utility function rather than GDP. Just saying that, we had a 3% growth, we are doing fantastic. No, that's just GDP. GDP does not take into account inequality. You need a social utility function which also takes into account inequality. So, I said that at the highest level of the economic system, you realize the value of labor, which is satisfying and which is productive, and you don't want such kind of work to be lost. You have these entire free trade agreements and technological advancements have led to these job losses, And uh, no, what like this may actually, no, economists may say that the GDP will increase with free trade agreements and technological advancement, and winners can compensate losers, so there need not be any losers from free trade agreements and technological advancement. But actually, that doesn't happen. What we've seen is that doesn't happen, and what we've seen is that the inequality has been increasing. Also, suppose even winners compensated loser, then at the highest level of the economic system, you realize that you want work itself as value. You know, if a farmer goes and plows a field and plants seeds and produces food for the world, that has value. That is more valuable than using a combine harvester where somebody's pressing a few buttons and it is doing the job of 50 farmers. Yes, there's increase in productivity, but the quality of work has gone down. The satisfaction from doing that work has gone down. If a person has to work only, gets work for only 2 hours a day, then the remaining 10 hours a day, how will it be utilized? Pascal said something, right? What did, was it Pascal? I think it was Pascal. Yeah. I have discovered that all human evil comes from this: man's being unable to sit still in a room. So having our energy utilized to be productive is valuable, and increasing technological advancement takes that away from us. And that's at the highest level of understanding of what sort of economic system we want. Okay, and then we have, so you see, when these free trade agreements come or the technological advancement happens, parts of the economy suffer job losses. Okay, and when initially the free trade agreements happened, a lot of manufacturing in the Midwest, there were job losses. Now with self-driving technology, there may be job losses for semi-drivers, and you can see that there are 3.6 million semi-drivers in the US, but it's a very large number, but it's still not large enough for any effective political action to stop it from happening. So what workers need to do is, instead of like some workers losing their jobs in the 1980s, and then some workers losing their jobs in the 90s, and some workers are going to be losing their jobs in 2020s with like self-driving technology. No, all these workers should be together, and it should be that they need to unite, and such changes to the economy like free trade agreements or new technology should only be allowed when alternative jobs have been created or those who have jobs are otherwise compensated. And then, of course, like I just mentioned, the deeper point, at the highest level of the economic system, you have to think whether labor saving advancements are beneficial, to what point are they beneficial, and at which point do they get harmful. I actually remembered one more anecdote which I think is kind of very revealing. So the question is that, okay, if somebody's very highly paid in the free market, do they deserve it? And or like, you know, or does redistributive taxation make sense, because there is a lot of undeserving wealth. Now, so when I had a student, a PhD student, who later became a dear friend, and this is about almost 25 years ago. And that time there was this dominant e-commerce firm. And my student was like, a lot of people who are wanting to get into the internet, they do startups. So he had some ideas. He went to a marketing professor at the university. And the marketing professor said, look, there's no point in you trying to do anything because the game is over. This e-commerce firm has won, and they're just going to kind of continue, and they will. There's no point in them trying to enter because the game is over. Anyway, 25 years later, or about maybe 24 years later, where is that e-commerce firm now? Its market capitalization is $30 billion. Its competitor, who was at that point a very small firm, now has a market capitalization and is a major e-commerce firm, has a market capitalization of over $2 trillion. Okay, so definitely that firm underperformed. They didn't do anything to maintain their position. Now, what about their management? So their management, whatever management they have, they chose the next management, and the next management chose the next management, and this thing continues. And they get millions of dollars and are not at all penalized for their underperformance. The firms which really create value usually have their founders running them, and you have what are they of the 4 or 5 firms whose market capitalization exceeds $1 trillion, most of them have, or 6 firms, most of them have their founders still very actively engaged. And so, the point is that can't really say that the free market pays everybody the value they produce, and sort of justification for a redistributive taxation. Well, also, like I said, some of the founders have really done well, and they produce a lot of value, and they've become very rich. But there are still other entrenched management being paid millions of dollars who are just not doing anything. Okay, moving on. The next level of improvement in economic systems after redistributive taxation is really job security. And this sort of goes to this, I have this economic system, which I also am going to describe in not this book, in my next book, The Nature Ternary. And that economic system is, I call it the ranch model. It's like everybody was given a ranch. And what are the features of a ranch? Well, the features of a ranch is that the people who used to have ranches, they were doing well. They would have a good life. They worked hard. They ran their ranches successfully. They did not have to worry about if they were like being treated badly by other people. They did their job. They produced their whatever they were producing. They got paid. Okay, and so if you had a ranch, you were born with a ranch, you're a lucky guy or a gal. Now, so in the ranch system of economics, or the ranch model of economics, is that the government actually creates a virtual sort of ranch, the conditions for everybody who's born to have a virtual sort of ranch. And that requires the government to give them job security. So if a person wants to work, they should be able to go to the government and work on the government job. Now, of course, the problem with government jobs, as we have found, is that they lack the sort of incentives and accountability which a free market produces. So, when the government provides work, there should be it should like still be less, the salaries should be less than what you would get in the free market, so that people are encouraged to move on to the free market, where there is incentive and accountability. However, if somebody wants to just, doesn't care about getting the extra amount of money in the free market and just wants to continue working with the government, that's okay. As long as, so the challenge is to kind of make sure that the government jobs are actually productive. Just don't want to be in a situation where being in a government job means that you're just sitting there wasting your time. There is no intellectual challenge and stuff like that. Also, one way in which you can have more ranches, that is, you have more jobs which are intellectually challenging, which reward you for your work, is to prevent firms from becoming very large. You just you can say that having smaller firms is a public good, and the way to encourage smaller firms is to tax them lighter. So larger firms or even give the smaller firms subsidies, so that the larger firms have an incentive to break into smaller parts. Because really large firms are like the death of the soul. They're just like politics ridden, and they are just too much of managing your image, and the intellectual content is very low. There's too much politics and too little intellectual content. So when you break up larger firms into smaller firms, then they become more, they have to care. The smaller firms, firstly, smaller firms means that there's probably going to be more competition, so they have to worry about performance. And secondly, because the layers between the people taking the actions and the people doing the work, there are not so many layers. Okay, the more layers they are, the less insulated the people who make the decisions are from the actual performance, and politics becomes more and more important. So one way in which you can produce more of good jobs is to have smaller firms, and to give incentives for larger firms, economic incentives for larger firms to break up into smaller firms. And how do you define the firm? Well, let's say you have a very large firm, right? Can it be broken into 5 or 10 smaller firms? Yes, it can be. And the definition of a firm is that it has its, let's say, its own income statement, and then it contracts with other of the smaller farms which came out of those large farms to still produce that whatever they were producing earlier, but they each individual smaller farm has its own profit and loss accounting, so that they have more incentive to run efficiently and to actually give people reward people for performance rather than politics. Okay, and then at the highest level of economic system is the realization that we are actually trying to provide people an environment where they can live their best possible lives. Okay, so we are trying to provide an environment where people have the are in a situation, and now the thing is that if you follow the way economists think, and it is that more productivity is always good, right? So like productivity is supposed to be great, but that is not true. We have to first develop an understanding of the ourselves, and then I think I have a section called the scientific model for human behavior, mental health and happiness. I think that's what the name of the section is. Anyway, in that section I basically cover what is it that gives us a good life. And there you realize when human nature, you have to understand human nature, and like just this like frivolous assumption that the more you consume the happier you are has led to a lot of trouble and it does not work. So there the human nature is understood as something that has been produced by evolution. So to understand human nature, we need to understand evolution, and of course, just by understanding evolution, you can't like totally say this is human nature. Then you also have to have observations. Okay, so your observations of humans plus evolution gives you human nature. Evolution is like it produces the skeleton for human nature, and your observations adds flesh to it. Now, if so when you have this understanding of human nature, what you also realize, and there like the argument goes that human nature, what we are really seeking is labh, and I call it labh, which can be like satisfaction, pleasure, happiness, enjoyment, whatever. It's a reward from the brain given to us for things the brain considers important, for having done the things the brain considers important. Labh, that's one word. Okay, which covers a variety of rewards which the brain gives us. That's what we seek. So we seek labh, and the point is that doing work which is satisfying, which we feel that we have done our duty, that we have taken care of the people we love and care for, and which requires us to expend our energy, this work is a source of love. If all of our work was replaced by robos, that love would be gone. Okay? So this is essentially an understanding of the fact that more and more mechanization and more automation, which makes us requires us to do less and less labor, is not the way to go. It's a dead end. It's going to lead to failure. It's going to lead to people who are weak. What we need is for people to be given work which they have to do so that they can become small, so that they can become confident, strong individuals. So this elimination of work by more and more automation and artificial intelligence, this is a bad idea. Yes, leisure is good. We enjoy leisure, but there can also be too much leisure, too little work. So we have to find the optimal amount of work that we should be doing. Now, can you force somebody who doesn't want to do work, say, and like who says, well, I can get this robo and I can do this work. Why are you forcing me to, let's say, do the dishes? And the answer is that yes, it's kind of, one shouldn't really be forcing their view of life on anybody else. So if somebody says, I don't want to do my dishes, I want to buy this robot who's going to do the dishes, okay, fine, go ahead. If that's their choice, that is their choice and they should not be stopped. But there are people, who actually understand human nature will realize that is some amount of work is necessary for the best possible life, and they will therefore voluntarily agree to setting limits on how less work they can have to do. They're not going to force anybody else. It's just going to be they'll set limits for themselves. Okay, moving on. So those are the three levels of improvements in economics. The first was redistributive taxation. The second was assured work, sort of giving everybody a ranch. And the third is that realizing that there is upper limit to how much you can reduce work, or if your work falls below a lower limit, you're actually going to be worse off. Okay, then let's just kind of look at what has been, obviously some of the stuff I've been talking about is not, you won't hear it elsewhere. Now, I have actually studied a lot of economics, and I was a grad student at JNU in India, where we had Marxist professors, and then I went to Yale and University of Chicago, which are the heart of capitalist thought. So I've had quite a wide experience when it comes to economics, and of course these academics don't agree with each other. They just say that the other side is wrong, and then the question is, okay, what is it that you should be watching for? Let me just say, I have a lot of respect for Chicago's stress on empirical validation. So they just don't go around saying things, they try to kind of back it up with data. So that was, I found that very admirable. Okay, so let's move on. So the main promise of the Marxists was greater equality. And the basic error of those who work for the revolution was not understanding that power comes in two forms, economic and political. And uh, while state ownership of economic assets did result in greater economic quality, it also had a severe loss of incentives and accountability. And there was a huge disparity in political power. Political power was not like thought of as anything wrong, because the political power was with the Communist Party, and of course the Communist Party was noble. That's what they said, and we said otherwise you were in trouble. So it's tragic in the sense that a lot of very intelligent, passionate, well-meaning people worked to make this a success, but when it actually happened, what was seen was that because of their lack of complete understanding of human nature, the result was a disaster. And they were very disillusioned. A lot of them, were persecuted. So that's the issue with the left. Now, on the right, of course, there's a lot more freedom, and that's wonderful. And like I said, Chicago stressed empirical validation. That was very admirable. The problem I had with their economics was that they do not have a social utility function for their models. So you have these models, you have your first order conditions, you get to the equilibrium, you prove that there is only the equilibrium is unique by using some fixed point theorems and so on. And then you kind of do like comparative statics. You sort of say that, okay, if I introduce this change, let's say I introduce a policy change, how would that change the variables in the equilibrium? No, that all is fine. That all that's, if you're going in that path, you have that kind of reasoning. If your like underlying assumption is more consumerism is better, that all is fine. But any mathematical model, and when you're doing comparative statics, any mathematical model, when you want to have a policy implication from that model, it has to have an objective function which is being maximized. If it doesn't have an objective function, then you just can't play along with a mathematical model. I mean, what is the purpose of it? You don't know like which situation is better than another, because you can't compare two different situations. So you have to have an objective function. And the GDP became a stealth objective function in these models. And as long as the policy said that, okay, it's increased the GDP, that was fine. Okay. But the problem with GDP as a function being maximized is that GDP does not care about distribution. And any utility function, if you want to make a case for any utility function, it should take into account distribution. And but like if you want to try to take into account distribution, you really get into you get into political issues. So you have to kind of choose a utility function, and then you have to kind of say that, okay, I'm going to put this much negative weight on inequality. So the larger the inequality, the more negative weight will this have. And that is a completely political statement. And, they want to appear to be just scientists, and not like anything which is political. So it's difficult for them to formulate a social utility function. But that obviously is, I mean, what is the use of your model if it doesn't have a proper objective function? I think it kind of led. I remember one famous economist at Chicago, or maybe like their like leading economist, said something like, why are we even concerned about business cycles where, sure, there are business cycles, but if you look at like what the consumption impact of it is, it's not that much. We should really be thinking about how we can get, let's say, 1% more growth. Then the utility functions are very maximized, are much more maximized. And if you have a representative agent, you say that, okay, the utility function of the representative agent is our objective function. And then the representative agent's consumption is essentially the GDP, right? So you are putting some penalty on the variation which happens through the business cycles, because utility risk representative agents' utility function will be risk averse. However, the point was that, okay, just add like 1% and all this loss due to risk aversion will just be submerged, it'll be much less. So, the point is that, yes, in that thinking, GDP becomes very important and the issue of inequality becomes unimportant. But that is a mistake, because if you want a strong community, you want a strong society, you have to have the people, the large majority of people or everybody, believing that the system is fair to them, so that they are invested in the system, and then only can the society or community achieve its great goals. If there is growing inequality, then people who are losing out will feel more and more alienated. And you tell them, oh, no, it's, Pareto optimal, like whatever we are doing. The winners can compensate the losers, but that doesn't happen. Winners don't compensate the losers. Winners have not compensated the losers from all these free trade agreements, which have increased inequality. So this issue of inequality cannot be ignored. For a strong and well-functioning society or community that achieves its great goals. Okay, let's keep moving on. Yeah, the common failing of the left and right is that it's just a very one-dimensional view of human nature, and they both like bought into this consumerism fallacy. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Marx said like, production or something is very important, and everything is subservient to economic production. That's just a wrong understanding of human nature. And of course, that was on the left, Marx, and then on the right, of course, yeah, they're like, more GDP is great. As long as you have more GDP, then everything is going well. Okay. So this is the consumerism fallacy. And if you're really going to say that you are going to have solutions for humans, you have to have an understanding of human nature which is not partial. Yes, more consumption may kind of lead to a better life, But then there are so many other things that you have to consider, like whether a person feels like they've done their duty, whether what sort of relationships they have with other people. And ignoring all those and just like sticking with the consumerism fallacy is something which you see both on the left and the right. One could even say that maybe Gorbachev, back in the mid 1980s, gave up on the Soviet experiment because, or not really him, but like I guess the system which put him in place, because they felt they were falling behind in the production of material goods. And of course, there was also the issue that they realized that there were many people in their societies who thought that they were not being treated fairly. Okay, so economic growth is desirable for poor countries, where there's poverty, where there is like not everybody has food and shelter. But the idea that economic growth is equally desirable in already rich countries is just a lack of deep thinking. Okay, so some of this stuff is in here, the book. Buy the book. It's great. Okay. Now, lack of progress in economics. Nothing surprising. Root of the problem is that there is lack of accountability. Any organization which lacks accountability malfunctions. It's a given. Okay. And no editor of an economics journal ever got fired because the economy went into a recession. So they publish what they want to publish. They publish what they feel is right. They publish whatever is the dogma and whatever they have themselves said when they were younger. And where is the accountability? What if they're publishing things which are not really helpful to the society at large? Does the society fire them? No, it does not. They continue. And new ideas, of course, face obstacles to acceptance. And nothing particular, I don't want to be seen like I'm especially criticizing academics. This is something which is everywhere. This problem is there everywhere, where large organizations without accountability malfunction. So, an important aspect of a desirable economic system is that the market for corporate governance works. The market for corporate governance is essentially encouraging the managers to perform well to create value for shareholders. And what happens in the real world often is that entrenched management, due to information issues, do not really have to deliver performance. And that is a loss for not only the shareholders of the firm, but the society at large. So, this is like rather common. Entrenched management of large firms have no accountability unless the founders continue as CEOs or have a significant influence in the choice of the CEO, or there is a rare CEO who is a high performer. And these poorly run firms where the senior management is insulated from market pressures, does not have accountability, are not good places to work. They're rife with politics, and they spend a lot of time on posturing, trying to like virtue signaling. Okay, now, of course, I've already discussed how larger firms should be split into smaller firms, because smaller firms are better, have better accountability, have a better culture. Now, there's other uh, solution, and that is if it is to make the market for corporate governance work better. Okay, so I spent some time on this issue, and I realized that the problem with corporate governance not working right is fragmented shareholders. It is not worth the reward for small shareholders to invest resources of time and money holding the entrenched management accountable. So that is like the source of the problem. And now there is supposedly this market for corporate governance where corporate traders are supposed to take over firms which are not being run well, turn them around, and get a share of the increase in value. Now, however, there is a issue, you can say free rider issue of this in this market, and it is essentially that the shareholders would expect that the value of the firm would rise after the takeover, and this would cause the price to rise before the takeover itself. The shareholders would not sell their shares at the lower value, at the value at which the current management is producing for the firm, because they realize that this rate is going to come in and increase the value. So they would only want to sell at increased value. Now, however, if they are not ready to sell at the lower value, then the raider would have to pay more, and this would reduce the value of the gain the raider would make. Okay. And really, I mean, the existing shareholders will want to only sell at the new value which they expect the firm to be, or if if they think that there's a certain probability of a high value and a certain probability of the continuing low value, then and if they're risk neutral, then they would take they would be they would put the value of the firm at the expected value, and they would be, if they're risk neutral, they would be willing to sell at the expected value. Anyway, which would still reduce the gain which the trader would make. It becomes sort of a game theoretic situation. If the shareholders raise the price to the value which the shareholder would achieve, then the shareholder does not have any incentive to take over the firm anymore. And in which case the shareholders will not receive that gain in value. So now I found that this problem of corporate governance had actually been discussed. A couple of academics had already discussed this problem. That happened with most of my ideas when I was a PhD student. Somebody else had already done it, and I was not great at reading existing literature, so I used to come up with these ideas which were already there. Anyway, what was not there was a solution. Identifying the problem is important. Offering a solution is even more important. Okay, so what can be done to make this market function. Now, you can put a set of covenants into the firm's charter which will facilitate the takeover of the firm by the raider. Now, why would a firm want to put such a covenant in its charter? Well, part of the covenant is that there will be a premium on the existing share price. Now, if the raider is ready to pay a premium of, let's say, 10%, could be 20%, could be 100%, I don't know, and say that they want to purchase 35%, and not the covenant says that they have to purchase at least 35% of the firm, let's say, to give them control, or whatever the shareholders think, or whatever the raider thinks will give them control. So this could be like, for example, it could be like 25%. Okay, and this could be like, the premium could be over the average of the last 25 trading days, which is essentially to, if the news leaks out, then the raider still doesn't have to pay the higher price. Or if you want to give the raider more comfort of the news leak and not leaking out, then you can make this like 40 days, let's say, of the past 40 trading days. That'll be about 2 months. And then the firm will either issue new shares or buy existing shares. And they can give them they'll give them the premium of that 10% or whatever premium, and to get the raider to the required 25%. Or if the raider believes that they want a larger share, then they can say like 25 to 70%. Now, of course, the problem with a higher percentage is that the raider has to come up with more funds. Now, the raider may just want some inside information, and the firm is not going to go around handing out inside information to anyone and everyone who wants it. So what they can do is that they say, okay, you pay me like 0.1% of the market capitalization, and then you can have a detailed knowledge of the firm, things which are not even required to be publicly disclosed. And let's say if the raider does not follow through after receiving this information within like, I don't know, 12 weeks, 3 months, to then the 0.01% is forfeited. And if you introduce these covenants, it doesn't even require a raider to come in for an increase in the market value of the firm to happen. You're the shareholder of a firm. You should agitate for a firm to put this in the covenants right away, because as soon as you put those covenants in, you should see the price of the firm increase. And that is so because the probability that there will be a rate in the future goes up. And if you want, if you think that, okay, 10% premium is too less, make it 20%. But put that covenant in. If you're an activist shareholder, put these covenants in your firms. Not only will it increase the probability that there will be a raider who will increase the value of the firm in the future, but also existing management will become better performing because they will understand that they are no longer entrenched, and they will have to deliver superior performance if they want to keep their jobs. activist shareholders, note, these are the covenants, make it happen. Okay, so let's look at an example. One firm I mentioned was this big tech firm, which at one point was the dominant big tech firm, okay, in the market. Not many decades ago was a dominant big tech firm. But after starting around the 2010s, its market cap has remained stuck at like 120 billion for about 8 years, maybe 10 years. During the same time, competitors who went to the cloud and executed well experienced the three competitors, and the average increase in their market cap was $2,000 billion each. And this big tech firm, which did not experience this thing, was actually, I would say, because of its existing relationships with corporations, I would say that it actually had an initial advantage, but it completely blew it. Okay? Now, if a raider had gone in and the $6,000 billion increase in market cap across these three firms, if it was distributed among 4 firms instead of 3, then the market capitalization would have increased by $1,500 billion, which is something which the shareholders of that firm lost because of that management, entrenched management. If the raider got 35% of the increase in value, that would be about $565 billion. That is very lucrative. For such a large firm, you may even say like that, the raider could even get control of it at 15%. 15% of 120 billion is 18 billion. That's not difficult to finance. The famous takeover back in the 1980s was even larger. Okay, and then if the raider had, like, let's say 15% of the value of this increase of 1,500 billion, then this would have been $225 billion increase in value to the raider. And the government got taxes. The raider should still have enough left over to make it worthwhile. It may not be $6,000 increase in total value for this sector, because once you get a 4th firm which is also competitive, then the surplus which these firms receive decreases, but the rest of the world experiences an increase in surplus. So this is beneficial for the society at large. And also, so there are 2 reasons why it benefits the rest of the society, because firstly, the government gets a share in the increase in value in the form of taxes, and because of more competition, also society benefits. And of course, these firms are going to be better run, which is a nice thing, because you really want to work for a well-run firm. So, raiders don't have the best public image, but so the question is that should we really be increasing the power of the raiders with such covenants? Absolutely. Absolutely, because raiders may have not a great image, but the entrenched management, they do a good job of image management, but they are really they really need to be reformed. Okay, now raiders who get wealthy by turning around poorly performing firms are doing a service to society. give them an opportunity to create wealth, and tax them hard. They'll get very wealthy even after paying the taxes, and the government will gain from the taxes it will receive. Also, what about job losses? Because often, efficiency post takeover involves significant job losses to existing employees. But really, if you want to protect, jobs should be protected, but they should be protected by national laws rather than relying on inefficient firms to maintain bloated payrolls. There should be mechanisms at the national level to compensate workers who lose jobs and to provide them attractive alternative employment, rather than saying, yeah, let's keep these bloated farms, which are badly run but protected from competition, either due to size or whatever. That's not it's not really a nice place to work. So, it's better to work in a firm that is demanding but rewards performance, and it should be the government which is responsible for providing alternative, attractive employment. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to end the section of economics with just a few comments about my own experience. So when I started my PhD program, there were two major ideas in the finance. They were the things that people spoke about a lot, did a lot of research. And the first one was rational equilibrium pricing models. And the second was the Modigliani-Miller capital structure irrelevance. So I had something to say about both these issues. Okay. So the first one was, so these rational equilibrium pricing models are mathematically very appealing because they sort of, and when they first came, things like CAPM, it was, people said, wow, we now have a theory for why prices are what they are. And if you don't have a rational model, you really can't solve a mathematical model. You have to have these assumptions of rationality. Otherwise, anybody can choose any ad hoc assumptions. So the fact that these models were able to use rationality assumptions, which are much more respectable than some ad hoc assumptions about human behavior. For example, that humans save a certain percentage of their income, and therefore if the government pumps up spending, the GDP is going to move to a higher level. That's just an ad hoc assumption about human behavior. So the rational models were based on rational humans, and they, of course, were very respected and had a very great influence, and they came around in the 60s. So by the time you get 10, 15 years later, then they started empirical data. There was empirical work done which started contradicting these models, and specifically CAPM was contradicted by this thing about the size effect, where CAPM says that the only thing that should matter for the returns to assets are their betas, whereas the size effect said, hey, you take smaller farms, that characteristic also leads to higher returns. That was the first sort of empirical attack on these models. A more stronger attack came from this paper called the equity premium puzzle. Okay, and what it basically found is that the excess returns to US stocks was approximately 1% to 3%. Should be 1% to 3% if you have reasonable levels of risk aversion. Instead, what we are seeing was there was like 6% to 7%. Alternatively, you can say that stocks were being priced too low and were therefore generating too high a return. And this criticism, brought forth a lot of research, and they were like trying to salvage the rational models, equilibrium models, and it often took the form of like, okay, you change the utility function. You have, let's say, habit persistence, or there could be that there's a peso effect. Like the peso effect is just saying that, okay, you're only considering US stocks, and the US stock market has it's a exception amongst stock markets worldwide. For example, the Japanese and the German stock markets collapsed and with the war. So if you are just looking at the US stock markets, what you're not like accounting for is the fact that there is a risk for the stock markets to go bust, which the US stock market has not gone bust, and therefore whatever measured return you are seeing is too high a measured return. It's just that the US stock market happened to have got lucky. So there's explanations were there, but then I look at these models and said, look, prices and returns are not the only implications of these rational models. Volumes are also an implication of these models. Now, the essential point is that if you really have rational traders, there should be very little trading going on, because these traders have the same information. They understand that the other person they are trading with, the counterparty, is equally smart and has the same information. In these rational models, there's no information asymmetry. If you introduce information asymmetry, then where do you stop? Okay. So these rational models are based on no information asymmetry, no incorrect assessment of a person's own ability. That is rationality. And if that is so, why would two people trade? Because the person who's selling thinks that, okay, I'm smarter, the guy who's buying is dumb, and the person who's buying, because the price of this is going to fall, and the person who's buying says that this person who's selling it to me is dumb because this price is going to rise. So there is a difference of opinion, and that cannot be, that is not possible in a rational model. In a rational model, there is a reason for trading, and the reason for trading is that people have different levels of risk aversion, and you take a very simple model where you have, let's say, a riskless asset and a risky asset, and people, they make their, depending on the risk aversion, they have their optimal portfolio. People who are more risk averse will have less of the risky asset in their portfolio. People who are less risk averse will have more of the risky asset. People who are less risk averse will have more of the risky asset, and people who are more risk averse will have less of the risky asset. Okay. So that's the rational reason for trading would be, if the price of the risky asset changes, then those proportions in their portfolios will change, and it'll move away from the optimal. So the people who with different risk aversions would trade with each other. And how much, and how would that trade go? Suppose the price of the risky asset went up while its like risk remained the same. So the standard deviation, let's say, remained the same. The price went up, so the fraction of risky asset in the portfolio for all traders went up. Then the traders who are more risk averse will want to reduce the amount of risky asset in their portfolio, so they will sell to those who are less risk averse, and that's when trading. So that's a rational reason for trading in a rational equilibrium model. And where does that lead us? Well, so you can do it. You have a reason for trading, and you estimate how much that trading should be, just like in the equity premium puzzle. There was an estimate done where they estimated how much the equity premium should be, and they found that it was completely out of whack. It should be like 1% to 3%, whereas they were observing 6% to 7% in the economy. So similarly, I did a estimate for volumes, and what I found is that if you have like whatever the transaction costs are really going to reduce trading. So for observed transaction cost, the volumes in the markets were about 20 times higher than what the rational models were saying. The point is that you're trying to rescue these rational models, but prices and returns are not the only prediction of these models. Volumes is also a prediction, and these models totally fail when you try to explain volumes using these models. I mean, the obvious explanation is that for these larger volumes is overconfidence. When people sell, they believe that they know better than their counterparty. They believe that the price is going to fall, and the counterparty does not know that. They know better. That's why they are selling, and vice versa for the counterparty. So they're both like, at least one of them is overconfident. One of them may be kind of made the right estimate of the price, but there's certainly at least one of the party is overconfident. And so again, you have this problem with rational equilibrium models, and that can't be explained. These volumes can't be explained by some of the things which people were trying to explain by changing, modifying those models. Or at least I didn't see any attempts to explain larger volumes, because I thought it was a problem, the larger volumes, but the rest of the profession did not think it was a problem. I don't know why. Okay, moving on to Modigliani-Miller. So the Modigliani-Miller capital irrelevance suggested that firms that had a positive NPV project will receive financing. Okay, so positive NPV projects are not going to be denied because the firm can't borrow money or raise financing. If they are denied, then Modigliani-Miller capital irrelevance is no longer true, because then you have firms which are having to forego positive NPV projects because of their capital structure, so which will lead to a fall in their value. So then capital structure is no longer irrelevant. So Modigliani-Miller implies that firms should not face a cash constraint because of their capital structure. And the way it was tested is that they took a large data set to test whether firms with higher leverage invested less. Higher leverage, they have more debt, they have to pay more as interest, they have less money left to invest. And so, there's a regression run, and leverage turned out to have a negative coefficient. Then came what economists do, and they said, hey, wait a minute, you found a correlation, but it's not causality. Yes, it doesn't mean that negative coefficient doesn't mean that higher leverage is causing lower investment. It could also mean that because a firm has lower investment possibilities, it also has a history of having lower profits. Lower profits historically, lower investment possibilities. Lower profits also lead to higher leverage. So it's not, the causality is not going from leverage to investments, it's going from actually whatever investments you're seeing back to leverage. So this is what is also called the endogeneity problem. And to address it, they used control variables. But when you use control variables, you're just throwing something to the regression and hoping that it'll clean up whatever endogeneity there is. I mean, there's really no good theory to say how much it'll clean up or how it should work. And it introduces multicollinearity, where there are different variables, each competing, trying to explain, fighting with each other, trying to explain why the explained variable is what it is. And I found those regressions very messy and very unappealing. This whole thing of control variables was... So what did I do? Well, I said, let's get rid of this control variables. You're worried about leverage having this endogeneity problem. I'm not going to use leverage as the explanatory variable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break up leverage into its components. Right? And why components? Because leverage is like this sum of all different things, but the components themselves may tell us much more about the world, what the world is. Right? I'm going to break up leverage into old leverage and change in leverage due to equity issues, change in leverage due to debt issues, change in leverage due to dividends paid. Now, these are all things which can contain information. Equity can, a firm may issue equity in a certain circumstance, it may issue debt in circumstance. There was also, I'm pretty sure I also had another one here, and that was change in leverage due to income. Or if you're using financial statement, it'll be net income. Okay, so look at the components and see what kind of coefficients they have. And the results were super. It was like as beautiful as a poem. It went exactly as you would have expected if there were informations in these variables. The component of leverage due to recent earnings had a very highly negative coefficient with investment. And that again is because recent earnings will push down leverage. And if there are high recent earnings, that means the firm also has good investment opportunities. So the firm with a component of leverage due to recent earnings had a very negative coefficient with investment. and then you went back in time, you look like, let's say, 2 periods ago, what was the impact of the component of leverage due to earnings? It again had a high impact, but less than the recent one. And then as you kept going back in time, the impact died out. And when you when you like went back in time, all these things which as you go back in time, you would expect them to have less information, and then they all converged. See, they sort of like got towards close to each other, and that is the impact. That convergence is the impact of leverage on investments without information, without endogeneity. So this was a method to address the endogeneity problem and make an accurate estimate of what the impact of leverage was on investment. The results are beautiful. And what else did I find? That coefficient was about 9%. And what is 9%? 9% is actually more than what firms pay on their debt. What do firms pay on debt? Maybe 7, 8 or whatever. So what it was telling you is that firms with high leverage, high amounts of debt, are not only investing less by the amount of interest payments which they are making, but are doing something beyond that. So not only are they constrained because of the interest they are paying, but they are actually reducing their investment even further. And why would they do that? They would do that because firms with high leverage want to move to a situation of lower leverage. So they're ready to forsake positive investment projects because they want to get to a lower level of leverage. Management is afraid of leverage. They don't want to go bankrupt. So they don't want too high leverage. And so they're not only reducing their investments by the amount of interest they're paying, but they're also, if they have high leverage, then they are reducing investment further so they can move to a lower leverage. And on the other side, firms which have low leverage are investing more because they have to pay less interest. And also they're investing more because they feel comfortable about increasing their leverage. So I call that like the super cash constraint hypothesis, where the impact of leverage actually went beyond the amount of interest that was being paid. It went to, it actually went to an impact beyond the interest level. It has like very big policy implications. You want to understand how the economy works, then you understand that firms in the economy are constrained from taking on positive NPV projects because they have high amounts of debt. So then your policy should try to figure out how do you make it, like how do you ease their cash constraint. Okay. The final one is the plague of mathiness. This is just an anecdote. I mean, it's also like kind of tells you about how the economic profession has been, the direction it is headed. So the problem of mathiness, it's like, as described by Romer, says that just using math which appears to be fancy as a smokescreen. So I had this encounter in my, during my PhD days. So, like I said earlier, why people trade is a mystery, and the rational amount of trading would be much smaller than what an equilibrium model would suggest. So there was a paper published in a top economics journal, and this paper had a lot of mathiness. It used things like Kalman filters, which of course is not impressive to a mathematician, but is not very, that level of mathematics is not common in economics, okay? So, and the reason this paper said that there was trading is because some investors had private investment opportunities, and they're trying to kind of solve this in a rational equilibrium model. So then they introduce, they add private investment opportunities to the rational equilibrium model, and then they kind of generate a lot of trading. Okay, so then what is my objection? Well, my first objection, which I was discussing with this faculty, a very good person, a lot of respect for him. So I pointed out that if the explanation for trading was correct, then we should observe large volumes of money regularly exiting and re-entering the stock market. But this does not actually happen. You don't see huge amounts of money moving out of the stock market and coming back in. Okay, that's not how trading works. Trading is a lot of people, they'll buy some stock, then when they sell it, they'll leave it in the broker account, and then they'll use that to buy other stocks. Okay, so it's not really exactly that. And we don't observe that. So this claim that, and to be clear, leaving your money in your brokerage account is not a superior private investment opportunity. It's not a superior private investment opportunity at all. And so the author had actually presented this paper at my university, and he had kind of said that I was not there at the presentation, but the faculty told me that he had said that the private investment opportunities are actually other stocks in the stock market. For whatever. However that worked. So you have these traders who have private investment opportunity, and they are liquidating their positions because they want to move to these superior private investment opportunities all in the stock market. There's a flaw in that argument, and that flaw in that argument is that if people who don't have those private investment opportunities, what they're simply going to do is that they're going to buy the stock, because they realize that when they trade with these people, that they're going to be losing money. They can do better by actually investing in the stock index, which also includes all these allegedly private investment opportunities. So they won't lose out, and they won't underperform these traders who have allegedly private investment opportunities. So that explanation does not work. So this mathiness covered up a very deep flaw in this paper. Okay, so that's all the economics I will do in this video.